The night my mother-in-law called my mom the help, I was standing close enough to hear every word. I want to tell you how it happened. Not because I'm proud of every decision I made leading up to that moment, but because I think about it a lot and I've never said it out loud to anyone who wasn't there. My mom raised me alone. My dad left when I was 6, not dramatically, not with a fight, just quietly, like he forgot we existed. My mom worked as a seamstress out of our kitchen in Akron, Ohio. She hemmed wedding dresses, took in alterations, repaired things other people threw away. Our apartment always smelled like fabric and the iron she kept plugged in until 10 at night. She had a little shelf above her sewing machine where she kept a photo of me on my first day of kindergarten and another one from my college graduation. She used to say those 2 photos were the whole story of her life's work. I left Akron on a full scholarship to Ohio State and never looked back, not because I was ashamed of where I came from, but because I was hungry for something bigger, for something I didn't have a word for yet. I met my fiancé, Christopher, at a work conference in Columbus. He was presenting on real estate investment strategies, and I was in the audience taking notes, not about him, about the tax structures he was discussing. I was 3 years into my career at an architecture firm and had just been promoted to project lead on a commercial development account. Someone in my company thought I should be there. I'm glad they did. Christopher was charming in that easy, natural way that takes real confidence. Not loud, just certain. We got coffee after the conference and talked for 3 hours. He told me later he knew within the first 20 minutes. I was more cautious. We dated for 18 months. I met his parents, Gerald and Pamela Whitfield. No relation to anyone you'd know, at a dinner in their home in Dublin, Ohio, which is the kind of suburb where every house has a 3-car garage and a landscaper who comes on Tuesdays. The house was beautiful. Pamela had done the interior herself, she told me twice. Gerald was a developer, had been for 30 years, and Christopher had grown up watching his father close deals over dinner tables like this one. That first dinner was fine. Pamela asked polite questions. Gerald asked about my firm. I was careful, professional, warm. I thought it went well. The second time I saw them, something shifted. Nothing I could point to. Just a temperature drop. Pamela asked what my parents did, and when I said my mom was a seamstress, she nodded once, slowly, like she was filing that information somewhere private. I noticed. I didn't say anything. Christopher and I got engaged the following spring, in a park in Columbus where we'd had our 3rd date. He proposed with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mom cried when I called her. I could hear the sewing machine running in the background, and then it stopped, and then she just cried. The engagement party was held at Gerald and Pamela's house. Christopher's family invited 60 people. I brought my mom and my aunt, my mom's older sister, who drives a school bus in Cleveland. That was our whole side. I had thought about asking a few friends, but Pamela had sent a list of names for the guest count, and the math was clear. This was their party, with our names on it. My mom wore her good dress, dark blue, long sleeves, the one she wears to church at Easter and Christmas. She'd pressed it herself that morning. She carried a small white purse that had been my grandmother's. She looked like herself. Dignified and quiet, a little nervous. When we arrived, Pamela greeted Christopher first, then me with a cheek kiss, then glanced past me at my mom and said, "And you must be Janet's mother." Not, "You must be Ellen." Not, "It's so nice to finally meet you." Just the category. The placeholder. My mom smiled and extended her hand and said, "Ellen Marsh, thank you for having me." Pamela shook it briefly and said, "Of course," and turned back to another guest. I watched my mom's smile stay on her face like she'd willed it there. She was good at that. She'd had practice. The party moved into the backyard, which had string lights and caterers in black and white. My mom and my aunt were seated at a small round table near the edge of the yard, close to the gate. Every other table had 8 or 10 chairs. Theirs had 4. They were the only ones at it. I walked over and sat with them for a while. My aunt was being cheerful the way people are when they're trying to make a situation normal by acting like it is. My mom was asking questions about the catering, about the lights, complimenting things. She had this gift of finding something genuine to appreciate about any room she was in. I looked at that table. I looked at where it was. I looked at the other tables, all clustered together near the house, loud and warm. And I felt something settle in my chest like a stone dropping. Christopher came over and touched my shoulder and said everything was beautiful. And I said, yes, it was. And I smiled and I told myself I was overreacting. I wasn't overreacting. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in downtown Columbus that Pamela had chosen. Private room, prix-fixe menu, about 40 people. The seating chart had been made by Pamela. When my mom found her seat, she was at a table near the hallway to the kitchen. Christopher's aunts, his college friends, his parents' business partners, all closer to the center. My mom and my aunt again at the edge, again at a table that felt like an afterthought. I told myself it was seating logistics. I told myself there was no message in a chair placement. Halfway through dinner, I got up to go to the restroom and passed behind a cluster of Pamela's friends. I wasn't moving quietly. I wasn't trying to overhear anything. I just walked by at the wrong moment. One of them, a woman in a cream blazer with a laugh like a seal, was leaning in toward Pamela. I caught maybe 4 words clearly, but they were enough. The mother, the seamstress. Pamela's response was quieter, but her expression wasn't. She glanced toward my mom's table, a brief, involuntary flicker. The kind of look that doesn't know it's being seen. Then the woman in the cream blazer said, loud enough for a small radius, well, it's sweet that she came. Like my mother was a charity case. Like her presence was a kindness extended downward. I stopped walking. I stood there in the middle of that private dining room for probably 3 seconds, which felt like 10 years. Then I kept moving, into the hallway, into the restroom, where I ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror. My mother was sitting 40 feet away, in a restaurant she would never book for herself, wearing a dress she'd ironed that morning, because she wanted to be there for me. She had made me. She had stayed up late for every school project and early for every school start, and she had put me on that scholarship path with every sacrifice I barely registered as a child. And she was being discussed like a curiosity, like a contrast, like proof that I came from somewhere lesser. I dried my hands. I thought about what I was going to do. Here's the part I should explain, because it matters. 2 years before all of this, I had left my architecture firm and gone independent. I specialized in commercial development, the design side, project management, permit navigation. I was good at it. I built a client roster through referrals, and one of those referrals, 18 months before the wedding, had been Gerald Whitfield. Gerald's firm had been trying to develop a mixed-use property on the east side of Columbus for 3 years. 2 previous architects had walked away from the project due to zoning complications and a difficult relationship with the city planning office. I came in, diagnosed the problem, restructured the permit approach, and within 8 months had the project approved and under construction. Gerald was pleased. He hired me for a second project, a retail strip in Westerville. What Christopher knew was that I'd done work for his father. What he didn't know, because I hadn't found a natural moment to explain it, and because it hadn't seemed relevant yet, was the scope. Gerald owed my firm at that point a combined outstanding balance of $340,000 across both projects, with the third contract sitting in draft form worth another $210,000. I had also, at Gerald's request, brought in 2 private investors to the Westerville project who had trusted me personally. Their money was tied to my continued involvement. I was not just his son's girlfriend. I was his architect. I was the reason one of his projects was standing. None of this had come up at the dinner tables where I was smiling politely. None of this had registered to Pamela, apparently, as relevant to the category she put me in. And because I hadn't needed it to register, I had let it lie. Standing in that restroom, I decided I was done letting it lie. I went back to the table. I ate the rest of my dinner. I talked to Christopher about the wine, which was good. I made small talk with his aunt across the table. I smiled. I was patient. I was waiting. At the end of the meal, before dessert, Gerald stood to make a toast. He welcomed everyone, thanked the restaurants, said something warm about Christopher, said something about the future of the family, looked at me, and called me a wonderful addition. I kept my expression pleasant. Then I stood up. People probably thought I was adding something to the toast. Christopher smiled at me. Pamela tipped her head with a polished expression. I raised my glass and I said, "Thank you, Gerald, and thank you to Pamela for organizing all of this. I also want to acknowledge someone who means everything to me." I turned toward my mom's table. My mom has been here, quietly, the way she's always done things. She worked her whole life so I could be standing in rooms like this one. I hope this family understands what that means because she's the reason I exist, professionally and personally. My mom pressed her lips together and nodded at me with the kind of expression that bypasses words. There was applause. Polite, a little uncertain. Christopher squeezed my hand when I sat down. His eyes were soft and confused in equal measure. Pamela was smiling. That surface smile that doesn't reach the muscle. I wasn't done, but I took the rest of that night slowly. I needed to talk to Christopher first. That night, back at his apartment, I told him what I'd overheard. I told him exactly what the woman in the cream blazer said, and I told him I'd seen his mother's face. Christopher was quiet. He had the particular stillness of someone who has suspected something for a long time and doesn't want it confirmed. He said, "My mother has always been particular about presentation." I looked at him. "That's what we're calling it." He looked away. "I'll talk to her." He didn't. Or if he did, it made no visible difference. The week before the wedding, I had a scheduled call with Gerald to review the Westerville contract extension. It was a professional call. Calendar invite and everything. I handled it like I always had. Before we wrapped up, I mentioned that I had some personal matters to resolve in the coming weeks and would be in touch after the wedding about the third project. Gerald said, Of course. Big week." I said, "It is." The wedding was at a venue in Powell, Ohio. 120 guests. Christopher's family had a lot of people, a lot of connections, a lot of people who knew Gerald's name. My side was small. My mom, my aunt, 2 friends from college, a former colleague. 6 people. They were seated, I learned when I arrived, in the second to last row along the side aisle. I found out when my aunt texted me while I was in the bridal suite. She sent the message carefully, trying not to upset me. "Just wanted you to know where we are, in case you're looking for us." I was in a white dress with a cathedral veil, and I had a florist adjusting my bouquet and a coordinator asking me about timing. I read that text and I read it again. I handed my bouquet to the florist. I said, "Give me 5 minutes." I walked out of the bridal suite, down the service hallway, and into the main venue. I found the seating chart display near the entrance. My mom's name is there, table 14. I found table 14. It was next to the emergency exit on the far wall. I stood in my dress in the empty room, and I felt the last thing I had been quietly holding down come up to the surface. I had bent. I had smiled. I had given benefit of the doubt and second chances in silence when I should have spoken. I told myself that love was about compromise and family was complicated and Pamela would come around and Gerald meant well and Christopher would fix it. None of it had mattered. Not one accommodation I made had changed anything. It had only told them they could keep going. My mom was going to walk into this room and be placed next to the emergency exit at her daughter's wedding. And Christopher, who I had told directly, who had said he would handle it, who had watched this pattern play out for 2 years, was somewhere taking photos with his groomsmen. I went back to the bridal suite. I asked everyone to give me a moment alone. When the door closed, I took out my phone. I called Gerald. He answered on the second ring. "Janet. Big day. Is everything?" "Gerald," I said. "I need to tell you something before we go any further today." He paused. "Is everything all right?" "I've been thinking about the Westerville contract," I said, "and the Columbus project, and I've made a decision about my firm's involvement going forward." Another pause. Longer. "What kind of decision?" "I'm withdrawing," I said. from both projects. Effective today. My team will send the formal documentation this week. I've already spoken with the 2 investors I brought in. They'll be exiting with me. That will affect the project financing, so I wanted to give you advance notice to make arrangements. I could hear him breathing. Janet, he said, today is. I know what day it is, I said. I've known what day it was every day for the last 2 years, and I've been professional, and I've been patient, and I've been quiet. I watched your wife seat my mother next to a kitchen on a table by herself at your son's engagement party. I walked past her friends last week and heard what they said, and today I found out my mother is sitting next to the emergency exit. Silence. I am very good at my job, I said. Your projects are moving because of my work. The investors are in because they trust me, and your family has treated my mother like she doesn't belong in the same room as you. So I'm removing myself from your professional life the same way your wife has tried to remove my mother from your personal one. I heard him start to say something, and I said, I need to go get married now. Or not, but either way, this call is finished. I hung up. I sat in the chair by the window for a moment. The coordinator knocked lightly and asked if I was ready. I said, give me 1 more minute. I called Christopher. He picked up immediately. Hey, is everything okay? Are we, Christopher? I said. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Of course. Do you know where my mother is seated? Quiet. Christopher. My mom handled the seating. I know your mom handled it. Do you know where my mother is sitting? He didn't answer quickly enough. I told you, I said. In October, I told you about the engagement party. In December, I told you about the rehearsal dinner. I told you that your mother's friends made a comment about my mom in front of a room full of people. You said you would talk to her. I did talk to her, and she put my mother next to the emergency exit. Silence. I love you, I said. I have loved you genuinely, and I have tried to make this work, and I have been patient in ways that I am not proud of, because patience was not the right response. I needed you to stand next to me. You didn't. Janet, I'm not walking down that aisle today, I said. I'm sorry. I know, but I can't. I heard him start to say my name again, and I said, I'll be in touch. Please tell your parents that Gerald is expecting a call from my office on Monday. I ended the call. I took off the veil first. Then I set the bouquet on the table. I sat in my dress for a few minutes because my legs weren't quite ready. Then I got up, and I went to find my mom. She was at table 14, next to the emergency exit with my aunt. They were looking at the centerpiece and talking about the flowers. My aunt saw me first, and her expression shifted. My mom turned around. She looked at my face. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, baby. And I said, we're leaving. She didn't ask questions. She stood up, picked up her purse, that small white purse that had been my grandmother's, and she took my arm. We walked out through the side door into the parking lot, and then my mom steered us toward a bench near some decorative hedges, and we sat down. She kept hold of my arm. We didn't talk for a little while. A bird was doing something in one of the hedges. The afternoon was warm and cloudless. Eventually, she said, do you want to tell me? I told her. All of it, including the part about Gerald. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the investors. They'll be okay? I almost laughed. Yes, Mom. They'll be okay. Good, she said. And she patted my hand. We went to dinner that evening, just the 2 of us, at a restaurant near downtown Columbus where I'd had a business lunch the previous month and liked it. We dressed down. I had changed at my apartment. She borrowed a cardigan of mine. We sat at a table by the window and ordered too much food and talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential. She told me a story about a bridesmaid's dress she'd repaired 3 days earlier. I told her about a building I'd been sketching out for a potential client. It was the best meal I'd had in a long time. Gerald's firm had to restructure both projects in the following weeks. The Westerville development stalled for 3 months when the investors withdrew and a new contractor had to be sourced. Christopher called twice. The first time, I let it go to voicemail. The second time, I answered and told him I needed more time, which was honest. We talked again in the fall, longer, and it was sad in the specific way that things are sad when they were genuinely good and genuinely didn't work. And it was no one person's fault, and also everyone's fault, and it was just the shape the whole thing had taken. My mom still has that shelf above her sewing machine. The photo from my graduation is still there. A few months after the wedding that didn't happen, she added a third photo, one my aunt took that afternoon in the parking lot, the two of us on a bench by some hedges, me in my regular clothes, her in my cardigan, both of us laughing at something I don't even remember now. I asked her once why that photo. She said, "That's the one where you figured it out." I didn't argue. She's usually right about things like that. I keep thinking about that shelf above my mom's sewing machine. It's not a fancy shelf. It's a piece of painted wood she put up herself sometime in the 90s, slightly uneven on the left side, and she never fixed it because she said it had character. For most of my life, it held two photos. My first day of kindergarten, my college graduation. She said those two pictures were the whole story of what she'd built. There's a third one now. People ask me sometimes whether I regret how things ended. Whether I wish I had handled it differently, stayed quieter, given it more time. I understand why they ask. It's a reasonable question from the outside. But from the inside, what I regret is the time I spent being patient with things that didn't deserve patience. Every smile I held in place, every benefit of the doubt I extended when the evidence was already clear. I told myself that was wisdom. I think, honestly, it was fear dressed up as grace. What I've come to understand is that how we treat people who can't immediately benefit us is the most honest thing about us. Pamela never bothered to learn my mother's first name, not because she forgot. She simply never tried. My mother, who had worked with her hands every day of her adult life to give me every opportunity she never had, was filed away as a category, a contrast, something to manage around the edges of a more important picture. And the cruelty of that wasn't loud. It was quiet and consistent, and it assumed I wouldn't notice or that I would notice and do nothing. I noticed, and I did something. What I did required knowing my own worth clearly enough to act on it. I had spent 2 years in that family's orbit, being professionally capable and personally diminished at the same time. And I had kept those two things separate in a way that wasn't sustainable. The work I did for Gerald was real. The contracts were real. The investors trusted me because I had earned that trust through competence and follow-through, not through connections or family name. That was mine. I built it. And when I finally let those two worlds meet, when I stopped protecting people from the consequences of their own behavior, the math was simple. That's the thing about integrity that nobody tells you when you're young. It's not just about being honest in the obvious moments. It's about being honest in the accumulating ones, the small decisions where you choose whether to notice what you're seeing, whether to name what's happening, whether to act in alignment with what you actually believe. My mom modeled that her entire life. She worked honestly, asked for nothing she hadn't earned, and carried herself with a dignity that had nothing to do with what she owned or where she sat in a room. I wasn't always as clear as she was, but I got there. The photo my aunt took that afternoon shows the two of us on a bench outside a venue where a wedding didn't happen. We're both laughing. I don't remember what at. What I remember is the feeling, the particular lightness of having finally stopped carrying something that was never mine to carry. My mom said that was the one where I figured it out. I think she was right. Not because I made a hard call or walked away from something difficult, but because I finally understood that protecting her dignity and protecting my own were never two separate things. They were always the same thing,